And we ask you to remain muted during the presentation, and then we'll have time for question and answer at the end. At this time, I would like to introduce Eleanor Laughlin from the Archaeological Institute of America, and she's going to do a brief introduction for us today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Archaeological Institute of America's Frida Renner Lecture. Chris Parmenter is going to give a talk for us today, but before we introduce him, it is both my duty and my pleasure to introduce you to some slides, there they go, okay. To introduce you to the Institute. So the Archaeological Institute of America has a trifold goal to excavate, educate, and advocate for archaeology and archaeological work. Basically, we are the largest archaeological organization in the United States of America, and the oldest also. We've been active since 1879. And so our programs and publications, if you join the Archaeological Institute of America, help you keep up to date with discoveries and research from around the world. If you join the Archaeological Institute of America, you will receive a complimentary publication. You can opt for either Archaeology Magazine, which is kind of a layperson's magazine for archaeology. It covers a wide range of topics from all over the world, beautiful color illustrations. It's actually my husband's favorite choice of magazines that arrive. He loves to receive the Archaeology Magazine in the mail. And then Archaeological Institute of America also publishes the American Journal of Archaeology, which is the premier academic journal of Mediterranean archaeology for academics, professional academics. If you have interest, you can attend a lecture, attend an archaeology fair. You can find an excavation. We have an extensive list of fieldwork opportunities listed on the website. Also, we offer trips to archaeological sites and different cruises and whatnot with professional archaeologists as guides. And aside from becoming a member, there is also a donation option for the Archaeological Institute of America, which make our research, preservation, actually we do have a footing in preservation of archaeological sites, publications, and all of these programs possible. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Phyllis Saarinen. She is a facilitator for the ILR. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming this afternoon. It's great to have another AIA ILR lecture. And I wanted to introduce Dr. Parmenter, a scholar of ancient history who currently specializes in the intertwined histories of race, culture, and long-distance trade in archaic and classical Greece from 800 to 500 BCE. In his research as an ancient historian, and you can see he's not ancient at all, Dr. Parmenter draws primarily on evidence that includes archaic poetry, letters from merchants and others, customs ledgers, and sanctuary assemblages. Having published many articles in multiple journals, he is working on his first book, Racialized Commodities, Long-Distance Trade, Mobility, and the Making of Race in Ancient Greece. He received a doctorate in classics from New York University in 2020. He is currently at the University of Pennsylvania as an Andrew Mellon postdoc and a lecturer at the Wolf Humanities Center. This afternoon, he will tell us about the development of the classical period Greek slave trading culture and its frontier on the coast of the Black Sea. So, Dr. Parmenter, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Phyllis and Eleanor. Really appreciate your introduction and the outstanding hospitality you've shown me here in Gainesville so far. And again, thank you to the Archaeological Institute of America for bringing me here today. And I hope you enjoy the talk. I want to begin our talk today with one of ancient Greece's saddest monuments. Just before World War II, farmers in Amphipolis, an ancient city located in the northern Greek region of Thrace, uncovered a monument discovered in the 1st century of our era. This was the funerary stele for a man named Aulus Capilius Timotheus. His inscription, written in Greek, reads, Aulus Capilius Timotheus, son of Aulus, freedman, slave dealer. Now, we know nothing more about this man, but the inscription can tell us an awful lot. According to Roman law, when a Roman citizen manumitted or freed an enslaved person, this former slave also became a citizen, but took the name of his former enslaver. So under slavery, this man's name was Timotheus, and now that he's free, his name is Aulus Capilius Timotheus. His profession was slave dealer, soma temporos, a term that combines the word for body, soma, and merchant, emporos. And finally, the man who commissioned this monument wanted us to know something about himself. He is quite proud of his trade. Although most of the Timotheus monument was destroyed in World War II, we have photos taken when it was unearthed. Up top, Timotheus is seated on a banquet couch in the toga of a Roman citizen. Attending to him are a horse and a slave who are represented as a miniature person. In the next register, we see some enslaved laborers carrying around dolia, which are big ceramic containers for oil and wine. And at the bottom, we see Timotheus, emotionless, dressed in a hood, leading a train of male slaves all chained together. We see the anguish on their faces as they pull back on their bonds. Behind them march distressed women and children. Why did Timotheus want us to know he was this cruel? Answering this will be one of the goals of our talk today. If you were to do a poll of most ancient Greeks or Romans, almost no one would tell you that the world could exist without slavery. In fact, Greece and Rome are historically unusual in depending on enslaved labor so intensely. They were what we call slave societies. A slave society is a term that was come up with 50 years ago by the historian Moses Finley and the sociologist Orlando Patterson. This term means a society where elites generated the bulk of their income from enslaved labor. Most societies in history, on the other hand, are what we call societies with slaves, in that slavery existed but was not the predominant form of labor. As generations of scholars have emphasized, slave societies are enormously complex and also diverse between one another. Enslaved people typically make up a very large proportion of the population, but even this varies by quite a lot. On the Caribbean isle of Barbados in 1750, 78% of the population was enslaved. In Florida in 1860, it was 44%, and elsewhere in the South, it was less. But these were all slave societies, one and the same, because anybody with elite status in these societies depended on enslaved labor. Engagement with the morality of the slave trade begins almost as soon as the ancient Greeks began to write. Our oldest literary texts are the two Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which describe an artificial, poetic world featuring details that can be dated between roughly 1200 and 600 BCE. The Homeric heroes lived big lives. When they ate whole cows, where they could pick up massive rocks. When dishonored, they screamed, cried, and murdered. And when Homer describes their estates, we learn that they enslaved hundreds of people. The Homeric heroes were indeed obsessed with the idea of slavery. As early as the beginning of the Iliad, we see the hero Hector brooding about the certainty that his wife, Andromache, will be enslaved when he is killed in battle. But the longest reflection comes from Book 21 of the Iliad, when the hero Achilles, who in a fit of rage has killed hundreds of men on the battlefield and is about to murder the hero Hector, comes across a former prisoner of his named Lycaon. Here is how Homer describes their encounter. Achilles caught sight of him, all unarmed, without a helmet or shield, and he had no spear, but he had thrown all of these from him to the ground. Well now, Achilles said, surely a great marvel is this my eyes look upon. Why, even the great-hearted Trojans I have slain will rise up again from beneath the murky darkness, just as this man has come back and has escaped the pitiless day of doom, though he was sold into sacred Lemnos. Lycaon grasps Achilles' legs and begs for forgiveness, relating the tale of how he had escaped from slavery. Achilles had sold Lycaon on the Isle of Lemnos in the North Aegean to Euanos, the son of the hero Jason, who, rather than becoming a warrior like his father, had gone into business as a slave trader. He says, "You took me captive in a well-ordered orchard, and led me far from father and from friends, and sold me into sacred Lemnos, and I fetched you the price of 100 oxen. Now I have bought my freedom by paying 3 times as much, and this is the 12th morning since I came back to Ilios after many sufferings." This story does not rouse much pity in the reader for Achilles. Achilles kicks the man begging for his life down, murders him in cold blood, and tosses him in the river for the fish to eat, and then watches. The Iliad story of Agamemnon's Greeks raiding the coast of Anatolia approximates the type of constant warfare that we believe was typical of Greece in what archaeologists call the early Iron Age, the period that ends around roughly 700 BCE. But in the century that follows, we see changes afoot in the people that Greeks enslaved. To start, we see early Greek writers increasingly identifying slaves with non-Greeks. The historian Theopompus regarded Chios as the first city that specialized in enslaving non-Greeks, and several early poets like Hipponax seem to identify a trade in people enslaved on the Anatolian mainland into the Greek islands. Athens emerged as another crucial early center. Around 590 BC, the great Athenian statesman Solon claims to have passed a law banning the enslavement of Athenians by other Athenians. In vivid terms, he laments that Athenians had, quote, been sold, one legally and another not. Some had fled under necessity's constraint, no longer speaking the Attic tongue, as wanderers far and wide are inclined to. And there are those who suffered shameful slavery right here, trembling before the whips of their masters, whom I set free. Other regions, though, decided to go in a very different direction. In 3 important regions of ancient Greece, Sparta, the island of Crete, and Thessaly in central Greece, enslavers turned inwards. These societies relied on a permanently subjugated class of people, who in Sparta were called helots. The Spartans believed they had conquered their ancestors in battle, and thus had the perpetual right to keep them enslaved. And you can see our earliest evidence for this quoted on the screen. Thus, by 550 BCE, slavery in ancient Greece had become extremely bifurcated in character. In Athens, the Aegean Islands, and on the coast of Anatolia, it was generally assumed that all enslaved people were foreigners and quote-unquote barbarians. In Sparta, Crete, Thessaly, and a few other places, those enslaved were often close enough to be members of the same family. It is around this time that we begin to see the emergence of complex institutions that regulated the trade in enslaved people. The earliest of these comes from Kyzikos, which is a city on the Sea of Marmara, which is going to be on the upper right corner of the screen, although it's not marked on the map here. And this city lay at the convergence of 2 important slaving routes, one from the Black Sea and one from the interior of Anatolia. Here, the city grants an exception to the tax on importing slaves to a trader with the name of Manes, which is actually pretty interesting because this is a clearly non-Greek name. The second interesting phenomenon is the earliest appearance of a complex warranty scheme involving slave sales, which we know from a city called Gortyn on Crete. According to this, enslaved people sold in public markets came with a warranty if they turned out after a public inspection of their bodies to be sick, resistant, or prone to escape. These physical inspections of the bodies of the enslaved at the marketplace were among the most deliberately dehumanizing aspects of the slave trade, as I'll go on to discuss a little bit later. Thus, by 500 BC, we have a very large, sophisticated network of slave markets across Greece, particularly in regions that lay adjacent to non-Greek slaving zones. What did the ancient Greeks think about the people they enslaved? Slavery in all societies where it is practiced raises an unresolvable conceptual problem. The slave is fundamentally a human being. That's where the value comes from. Aristotle described enslaved people as quote unquote living tools, subhuman beings only capable of serving a master. But when he attempted to differentiate what free and enslaved people should look like, he was unable to come up with a real difference. He writes, quote, "The intention of nature is to make the bodies of freedmen and slaves different. But as a matter of fact, the very opposite comes about." Nevertheless, ancient Greeks came up with a huge number of stereotypes to effectively do the work for them. As the historian Moses Finley would write in 1980, these, quote, ideological expressions effectively turned enslaved people into barbarians, people who were physically, mentally, and morally inferior to ancient Greeks. Even if this was absolutely not true, and even if most ancient Greeks didn't actually believe this, there's a very poignant comparison that we can make between attitudes towards enslaved people in ancient Greece and the way that white Americans thought about enslaved Africans in the 18th and 19th centuries. Stereotypes effectively produce the truth that is convenient for you. When many ancient Greeks imagined an enslaved person, the image on the lower left of the screen is what they saw. Red-haired, pale-skinned person with grotesquely distorted face. Ancient Greek writers went to huge lengths to describe what life was like in the two countries from which a very large proportion of slaves came from, effectively to try to justify why these stereotypes existed. The two regions which are most interesting to my research are Thrace, which was a region that bordered the North Aegean Sea and the Western Black Sea, and takes up the modern country of Bulgaria, Romania, and parts of Greece and Turkey. And the other region which I'm interested in is in Scythia, which is roughly modern Ukraine and Russia. The earliest ethnographies of the countries where people were enslaved that we find in ancient Greece were produced by the writer Herodotus, whose histories, written around 430 BC, constitute the earliest work of prose historiography written in Greece. And Herodotus was particularly obsessed with this idea of ethnography, or writing stories about other cultures and why they were the way they are. Herodotus understood Thracian culture, or at least he tried to understand Thracian culture, as literally a machine for producing enslaved people. It is custom, he writes, among the Thracians to sell their children for export. The Thracians do not guard their women. They see being tattooed as an honorable thing, whereas Greeks believe that only slaves could be tattooed. Herodotus' interpretation of Scythia is pretty similar. The Scythians were seen as brutal nomads who lived and died on the horse. Many of them were slave traders by day. Herodotus writes that the Scythians, quote, look upon everyone else as their slaves. When one of their kings die, they make a disgusting ritual of human sacrifice, crucifying the king's favorite slaves and turning them into these sort of disgusting human scarecrows. And this is a diorama of representing a passage of Herodotus in the Ukrainian National Academy of Sciences Museum in Kyiv. This explanation of Scythian culture would be taken even further a century later by a Greek writer named Clerus, who was a student of Aristotle, interestingly enough. As he writes, quote, the wives used to tattoo the bodies of Thracian women who lived in the northwest region bordering Scythia, pinpricking their skin with the points of their fibulae. This is why, years later, the wives of the Thracians who had been tattooed covered up the marks of their shame by tattooing the rest of their skin, so that their original tattoos, when incorporated into the design of another tattoo, might be passed off might be passed off as ornament. And if this passage seems a little bit tortured to read, it's because the Greek manuscript is in just terrible condition. The idea here is that the Thracians tattoo their bodies and cut their hair short because they are ashamed of being enslaved by the Scythians. What is interesting about all of this is that both Scythians and Thracians actually did tattoo themselves as marks of social status. And so on the slide you can see here are images of Scythian mummies excavated by Soviet archaeologists in the middle of the 20th century at a place called Pazyryk, high in the Altai Mountains of Central Asia. So this tattooing wasn't simply a Greek imagination, but was a real ritual that Scythians and Thracians did. But the more sinister thing was the way that ethnographic details, like, for instance, tattooing, become tools used by Greek slave traders as effectively a means of marketing people for sale in Greek slave markets. Greek slave traders, like our friend Timotheus, were notoriously dishonest, which might not be very surprising. They would routinely rename enslaved people to play with stereotypes in the imaginations of slave buyers. So, for instance, giving a Thracian a Scythian name. Other times, they would change hairstyles, they would inflict tattoos, or they would apply cosmetics. Slave markets then might be seen as the premier place where stereotypes were created in ancient Greece, and they served this very specific purpose. The cruelest formulation of this can be seen in epigraphical auction records, of which we have one from antiquity. This is the so-called Hermocopidae stele from Athens, which dates to 415 BCE. Here, enslaved people are listed by ethnicity alone. None of them, not a single one, has a name. They are listed as Thracian woman, valued at 165 drachmas. Thracian woman, valued at 135. Thracian man, valued at 170. Although Greek ethnographic writers liked to displace the production of enslaved bodies to the borderlands of the Greek world, sort of imagining that they're the way they are because that's simply the way they were born, what we really see is that these stereotypes, these imaginations, even these names of ethnicities are essentially being produced in Greece itself for the very limited purposes of selling people, turning real human beings into human commodities. For the remainder of this talk, I want to shift gears to look at how the process of enslavement worked itself, sort of in the very furthest periphery of the Greek world. And I'm going to look particularly closely at the world of the Black Sea, which of course has been in the news recently. For a lot of people in ancient Greece, it was pretty easy to imagine that the act of enslavement was something like Achilles capturing a prisoner like Lycaon on the battlefield. You capture a prisoner, you spare that person's life, and then that person becomes a slave. But in real life, this probably wasn't even usually true. The reasons why people fell into slavery in ancient Greece were, there was just simply a very long list. It could involve failing to pay taxes, it could involve losing a court case, it could involve surviving a shipwreck, being kidnapped, being impoverished, being born as an orphan. The ugliest thing about slavery was the fact that it took this institution of war, kidnapping someone on the battlefield, and carried this institution out in times of peace. We know all of this is true because we have primary documents that are written by slave traders. On the slide here, we see a merchant letter inscribed on a lead tablet, which dates to around 550 BCE. And so this is very early in the history of what we call archaic and classical Greece, probably about 100 years after the alphabet comes into widespread usage in Greece. It describes the fate of an enslaved man named Achilles, who came from a region, if you look at the red box on the map image in the lower left hand of the screen, this estuary where the Dnieper River flows into the Black Sea. The city where it was inscribed was known in ancient Greece as Borysthenes. In modern day, it's known as Berzan. The person who this letter was inscribed in Borysthenes, but it wasn't found there. It was found in a place called Phanagoria in Russia on the other side of the Kerch Strait, which means that someone brought it there, perhaps the person who was even responsible for transporting this enslaved man, Achilles. The question of the lead tablet is very interesting. This was a very remote region of the Greek world, and disposable writing materials like papyrus, which was like the ancient substitute for paper, were not really easy to find. And so lead ended up being the main writing material. More than 36 letters like this have been discovered around the Black Sea since the 1970s. The typical format is a merchant telling an agent working in a port to do something. So, for instance, to buy or sell a commodity, to collect debts, or to settle accounts. Oftentimes, the medium used to perform these transactions were slaves. The Black Sea merchant letters are tremendously useful documents. They date as early as the beginning of Greek colonization of the region. And so they're a useful source of information about mobility, trade, literacy, and for our purposes here, the history of slavery. But they're also extremely difficult documents. They're really highly fragmentary, as you can see on the screen. Oftentimes, we don't know what archaeological context they came from. So does it come from a house, from a tomb, from the bottom of the sea? We don't know. We also have the fact that we can't really consider them like an archive of documents. No single person is mentioned more than once in any of these letters. So we can't say this came from like a single person's house. So as documents for writing social history, they're really, really difficult to use. What I like to think is imagine if all of our history of the 20th century came from 3 letters and 5 news articles. So just very, very small amount of information. Nonetheless, even though these letters are so difficult to use and so widely dispersed, they can tell really interesting stories. Take the case of Achilles, who I was talking about a moment ago. Even though we know nothing else about this enslaved man, we know about this remarkable sea journey that he took in the middle of the 6th century BCE. Now, I've drawn on both the letters and literary accounts of the region from Greek ethnography to reconstruct the journeys taken by a handful of captives through the world of the Black Sea during the Archaic period. Retracing their itineraries can help us identify what Greek ethnographic writers like Herodotus got right or wrong about the slave trade. So let's use the letters to track how an enslaved person from what is now Ukraine might have ended up in the hands of a Greek slave trader. When Greeks first arrived in the North Black Sea coast after 600 BC, they set in motion massive social changes on the steppe and the forest steppe regions further to the north. Up on the steppe, we see that Scythian nomads begin to migrate from east of the River Don, while in the forest steppe, where the trees begin, we see the foundation of large enclosed settlements like Trachtimirov and Belskoe. The forest steppe was also a region of nearly constant, low-intensity warfare during this period, which may or may not have been motivated by slave trading. A good example is at Trachtimirov, built on a promontory above the river Dnieper, about 500 kilometers upriver from the coast. At the start of the 6th century, elites there were drinking imported wine out of imported Greek ceramics, but it all came to a crashing halt around 575 BCE, when the settlement was violently sacked by people shooting Scythian arrows. Captives were loaded onto canoes and taken down the river Dnieper to the island known in ancient times as Borysthenes, which was an important market for slaves. Borysthenes, located at the mouth of the Dnieper, and Olbia, which was another Greek city located in this estuary, served as way stations where goods from the interior could be loaded onto ships headed towards the Aegean. It is here that we met Phaeles, whose receipt was inscribed somewhere between 530 and 510 BCE. We also meet another captive here as well, a woman who had been enslaved by a merchant named Milos and was sold between 540 and 535 BCE. Temporally, neither Phaeles nor the woman enslaved by Milos could have been captured in the sack of Trachtimirov, but they might have been captured in a similar type of raid. But the letters illustrate other possibilities. The single best-known Black Sea letter in the scholarship is a document written by a man known as Achilles in Borysthenes in the late 6th century BCE. I'm not going to read this extremely confusing letter because there's been something like 50 years of extremely fierce scholarly debate over how to interpret this document. But what I am going to do is summarize it. So the story of the letter is that a merchant named Achilles is writing to his son, who is named Protagoras. Now, Achilles claims that he has been enslaved by another merchant named Madasus. And Madasus happens to be an Iranian name, which is interesting. It's opaque why this is happening. We learned that Achilles was a slave trader himself, and that Madasus has kidnapped both Achilles and Achilles' slaves. And the reason he had done this was in retribution against another merchant named Anaxagoras. And we don't know who Anaxagoras is or why Madasus was so angry at him. Madasus may or may not believe that Achilles is actually a slave belonging to Anaxagoras, but working as his commercial agent. So Achilles wants his son to get proof that he's a free man and he has nothing to do with Achilles. Phew. This letter is one of two documents that show the role of judicial arbitration in enslaving people among the Greek cities of the North Black Sea. So rather than being captured in the battlefield, people are being put through some sort of judicial process and being sold into slavery. Retribution was a specific legal maneuver allowed in Greek cities. Basically, if someone took your goods, you're allowed to impound goods belonging to another merchant from the same city. But we've never heard in any other Greek city a case of one merchant enslaving another merchant. Which is to say, this letter has many unique details, and among other things that are uncertain is what are the ethnicities of these people, what cities are they resident in, what specific legal rights are associated with them. Without attempting to answer any of these questions, we can make a couple observations here. The letters make certain that non-Greeks were actively involved in the slave trade. This is very clear. If people like Aristotle, who lives in Athens, could imagine that all slaves were barbarians, it was clearly not the case here. The second thing is that we see people with non-Greek names using legal or quasi-legal institutions to throw people with Greek names in chains. So we have a situation where barbarians are enslaving actually Greek people. If 6th century Greece witnessed the birth of like a dialectic between free Greeks and enslaved barbarians, we don't actually have evidence for it in our primary documentation of the slave trade, which means that this is a creature of ideology. Taking the letters together with our literary and other documentary evidence, we're thus able to arrive at a very dynamic picture of the history of violence that was the slave trade in ancient Greece. In big cities like Athens, people freely imagined that every enslaved person was a barbarian, and they even came up with racial or racialized stereotypes about what barbarians looked like in comparison with free Greek people. Writers like Herodotus came up with inventive stories to explain why people who lived very far away from Greece made naturally good slaves. But when we travel out to the margins to look at the primary evidence itself in the form of these letters, we find a very mixed picture. Here, there was no clear line between free Greek and enslavable barbarian. what people really cared about was power. Achilles was a slave trader who became a slave. He simply had bad luck. In many ways, then, we've come full circle back to the man we started with, Timotheus. He might himself have been like the men that he depicted straining against the collars on his funerary stele. In the letters, we encountered other people like him in the characters of Achilles and Achilles. Merchants of death like these men were men who made the slave system work, conveying labor kidnapped from the margins of the world to consumers at its center. Every now and then, archaeology has recovered stark reminders of what this cost is. On the screen here are remains of one of the few people in antiquity that we can be sure, from the disposition of their remains, was certainly enslaved, buried in a cemetery unscientifically excavated near the mining region of Lorion in Athens at some point in the late 19th century. But spectacular finds like these are the exception. In the record, slavery is something that usually lurks in the shadows, easily forgotten behind the splendor of ancient Greece and Rome. But make no mistake, these were slave societies, and 2,500 years later, it remains our legacy to negotiate. And before I finish here, I should mention that much of the material I mentioned in this talk today comes from the former Soviet Union, from Ukraine, and to a lesser extent from Russia. And of course, Ukraine is in a moment of crisis right now, and Ukrainian museums and archaeologists are suffering acutely. And so there are resources that I can put you in touch with, various projects involved to help Ukrainian scholars and cultural resources. Thank you very much.
Audience in the room? Okay, you mentioned slaves in Barbados, which we assume you African Americans, but I would note that there were also enslaved whites from Scotland, where the English religious civil wars. And for a long time, my father thought that our first ancestor to the North America was one of them. I've since discovered through Ancestry that that's not correct, but there were thousands of Scotsmen who were enslaved by the English in the 17th century and shipped to the colonies.
Yeah, so I mean, this is one of this is a phenomenon that historians of the Atlantic world and the transatlantic slave trade talk about a lot. And this is something that that really stands out in the minds of historians of race too, which is that in the 17th century, slavery is not, you would not call it pre-racial, but it's certainly not what it would become in the world of the 18th and the 19th centuries. And so we see a whole spectrum of coercive forms of labor appearing in the Atlantic basin. And there's a number of historians who have even argued that what would become sort of the most characteristic form of transatlantic slavery emerged out of these sort of intra-European forms of coercive labor arrangements. And so you see, for instance, indentured labor in Barbados, English Civil War, survivors of the English Civil War, in Virginia, and really all over the colonial space. Yeah.
Yes, Ellie?
Thank you. As a follow-up to that, I'm wondering, so during the 18th and 19th centuries in the United States, for example, I know of histories of slavery that involve the hierarchy of races. So for example, the Cherokee who had slaves.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there are any kind of hierarchical resonances that you see in this ancient past version, so that it's almost a way to bring oneself up in society, to own slaves and to be like the oppressor.
So I mean, and this is one of the characteristic things about what scholars consider a slave society, in that in order to have social status, you enslave people. In ancient Greece, and particularly in ancient Rome, it was impossible to be a person of any significance without keeping people enslaved in your house. Now, the other point, the point that you raised at the beginning, it is a really interesting point. And this is one of the places where we actually see differences in the ancient slave system from what developed in the Americas, which is that as slavery develops in a transatlantic context in the 17th and the 18th centuries, we have these racialized hierarchies that are building in a very formal way, which is to say that definitions of what is a member of a race are being imposed in actual law in both English North America and in the French colonial world
And Spain.
and Spain.
Costas.
Yeah, Costa painting. Yeah, and this is something which there's many semblances of it in antiquity, but it's not something that's nearly appearing in as formalized a way. So we have this idea that comes from Aristotle, which is if you're Greek, you are free, you own slaves. If you're a barbarian, you are enslavable, and then you are a slave. And this is something that Aristotle and plenty of other Greeks would really like to be the case. And it's an idea that we see percolating almost everywhere, but it's not something that's ever really consistently put into practice. And so we see lots of cases, particularly in the marginal areas of the ancient Mediterranean world, like the Black Sea coast, for instance, where these structures are either they never really emerge, or they emerge for a while and then they disappear. But we don't see like an identical trajectory that we get in much more recent history, our history.
Yeah, like consistency.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any questions from our Zoom audience? I don't see any hands. Oakland? Okay.
When did slavery end in ancient Greece? Or
It-
did it?
So this is a really interesting. This is a really interesting question. So one thing that everyone will agree with is that the super intense slave system of ancient Greece and Rome, it does not last forever. In the late Middle Ages, we see this fragmentation of these really sort of hierarchical Roman power structures. And as the political system becomes weaker and weaker and more fragmented, and there's less centralized authority, even though there's a lot more violence distributed through society, big sort of slave holdings start disappearing. And there's this period of this transitional period of centuries as antiquity ends. So we're talking from like around 400 AD into like 600, 700, 800. There's this transitional period when slowly this institution, it doesn't die completely, but in a lot of the Mediterranean, it either transforms into something else or is replaced by something else, like for instance, serfdom or sharecropping or things like that. But it is worth pointing that slavery, it doesn't die. And there's certain parts of the Mediterranean where it stays quite healthy. And one of the really interesting things is that one of the places where slavery stays viable as this sort of system of like social control of economic production is in the Islamic world, and it's in places sort of on the border of the Islamic world, like in Spain, for instance. And it's these institutions that are brought to the New World 1,000 years later. And if you look at, particularly in Spanish North America or French North America, the laws they have regarding slavery come directly from Roman law. So on one hand, you have these like big discontinuities between like our more recent history and like ancient Greece and Rome. But on the other hand, you have very clear continuities.
Do we have a question from the Zoom audience? Jim Grant?
Yes, yes. Good afternoon, and thank you very much. I'm interested in the lead mines. Have you been to any of the lead mines, and predominantly, where did most of the lead come from?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. To answer your question, I have been to not all of the lead mines, but I've been to some of them. So the image of the shackle that is on my last slide, this comes from the region of the lead mines, or I should rather say silver and lead mines, because they come from the same ore. So there's a number of places in the Mediterranean, or in the Aegean rather, where you can obtain silver and lead. In the North Aegean, there's several places, but the most important place was very close to Athens itself, in a place called Lorien. There's a big sanctuary that a lot of tourists visit today at Sunion, which is about 20 miles from Athens. And this whole region was pockmarked with lead mines and silver mines. And during the period of classical Greece and the classical Athenian Empire, there were tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of enslaved workers working in this, what's now a very bucolic landscape, working deep underground and also working in smelting. And we know this industry must have been very bad for people's health, but we don't have a lot of evidence for it, largely because of later disruption. But this is one of the interesting things, is that Athens, when it becomes the most important city in Greece, is both militarily powerful, but also all of the currency, all the silver currency comes from Athens itself because they're mining it, and all of the lead comes from it too. And so we don't know whether the lead that these letters were made of comes from Athens. The testing hasn't been done, but a lot of other lead objects from the ancient Aegean, the ancient Greek world, certainly came from Athens.
Well, since
Thank you.
copper was commonly used to write documents on, did you not find any copper documents in the slave trade?
No, actually, that's a curious thing. We don't, and there might be some issues of preservation there. But one of the really appealing things about lead is that lead is softer than copper, and it's much more malleable. And the way these letters were transported, I don't have a clear image of it on the slide. But basically, you can roll them up so they're really, really tiny. I mean, a document this big can be rolled up this big and put in your pocket, right? And if you are on a ship, there's storms, there's pirates. It's a very easy way to transport information. And you also don't have to worry about it getting wet.
Right.
During the Peloponnesian Wars, was a losing city-state then enslaved?
Yeah, that's a good question. So sometimes they were. Greek sources are notoriously finicky about talking about mass enslavements of other Greek people because they didn't like the idea, but it certainly happened. But one of the things we see is that when Greek cities like Athens are conquering other Greek cities and they're thinking about doing a mass enslavement, they're much, much pickier about who they enslave. So for instance, there's two very notorious instances during the Peloponnesian War. At Mytilene in 427 BCE, and at a place called Milos later in the war, where the Athenians come in, they kill the entire male population, and they enslave the women and children. Oftentimes, they preferred to kill male prisoners of war simply because of security issues or because of innate cruelty. They can't be separated from one another. But there was this conceptual problem for them, which is that if you believe that every slave is a barbarian or every barbarian is a slave, what happens when you enslave a Greek person? Does that person have rights associated with him? And the answer to that is simply to murder. So
The answer is to murder them.
yeah.
I'm recalling in Syracuse on the island of Sicily that during the Peloponnesian Wars, Syracuse itself was a colony of one of the non-Attic allies, the non-Athens allies. Athens sent a fleet to conquer Syracuse, and they lost. And all the men of the fleet were forced to work in this lime rock mine, which is now in the modern city of Syracuse. And they worked until they died. I mean, it was just, and I was down in this mine, and it was so mind-boggling that all these perhaps thousands of men were forced under the whiplash to mine the marble or the live rock until they died.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly cruel,
And-
no respect for an individual human at all.
And it was a very symbolic thing too, because the leader of the expedition to Syracuse is this man named Nicias, who is one of the wealthiest Athenians, one of the leading politicians during the Middle Peloponnesian War phase. And we know how he made his money because an author named Xenophon tells us, which is that he ran a leasing business of slave labor. He owned something like 1,200 people who he leased to work in the silver mines and the lead mines. And so when the Syracusans enslaved him, and eventually they killed him as a prisoner of war, there was a special irony for him.
Oh, yes. Any further questions? On the Zoom? I don't see anybody. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Parmenter.
Thank you very much.
You are a fount of knowledge.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
To point out that there are some copies of the Archaeology magazine over there. They're mine, and I value them, so please don't take them. If you have interest in AIA or archaeology, let me know. Julie certainly knows how to get a hold of me. Thank you.
Bye.